Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with London Paul. And Paul, before we came on today, we were looking at some topics to discuss. And one of the more interesting things, especially that has gotten blown extraordinarily out of proportion with the caveat that there is justification for people's concern over it, is in regards to what is known as the deep state or the establishment or the bureaucracy, depending upon where you are in the world. Now, one of the more interesting things is this type of topic and this quote unquote deep state or establishment goes back thousands of years. At the time of Christ, we had a group of individuals who claimed to be the keepers of the law that made decisions despite the fact that they were not the king, they were not the assigned individuals over the religious matters of the day, but they took it upon themselves to make decisions, even leading to a rebellion that saw change happen within the Roman Empire in about 70 AD. Then Sun Tzu, he even talked about the detriment of a bureaucracy, how it stifles innovation, it stifles good leaders from being able to make decisions when necessary. And then we move forward to today where we see it proliferated all throughout the West. But Paul, there's some interesting things I think we need to discuss, especially how establishments or bureaucracies are done in the West, in the US, and when you take a look at how it is in China. So, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of the discussion and welcome to the show.
Yes, and likewise, Ken. Obviously, we appreciate you joining me. Yeah, we think it's an interesting subject because it's a word or two words that is often used. And you're absolutely right, Ken. I think it's often a question of misunderstanding, misinterpretation. What does it mean? And in fact, it means quite often many things to many people. I don't want to labor the point, but the alt media has created certain elements within the sort of hierarchy and the order of what they believe how the world operates, and they make out certain institutions and the ones dictating policy decisions, and incorrectly, as far as I'm concerned. And therefore, I think it's an interesting topic because I think you have to start really, as you say, with respect to the West. How does the West function? And it's a lot simpler, I think, than people understand. And effectively, I think I'll just start with the following points. When a president or a prime minister is voted into notional power in a country, you'd be surprised how many of them don't realize that the ideas they had before they went into office and all these grand sort of ideals they had, and they were going to change all these things, they suddenly have a kind of dose of reality imparted upon them very, very quickly. So basically, they're sat down and told, look, in essence, you are not here to do anything other than be a figurehead. You will make speeches when you're required to make speeches. You'll attend certain meetings when you're required to attend meetings, summits, NATO, whatever, G7, G20. But effectively, there are certain no-nos. Now, you're never to interfere in US policy or US foreign policy. You are never to contradict NATO. You are never to criticize Israel. You are never to, in any way, shape, or form, appear to criticize or try and implement policy that could be damaging to the Federal Reserve, and by extension of the central banks or the financial system. And they're in a broad, and you can make small changes domestically that don't really matter, don't really affect anything in particular. But in essence, you're just there to be a figurehead that looks like you're the president or the prime minister, but you don't actually do anything. And I think a classic example of that, from my perspective, was always Merkel, because Merkel did absolutely nothing in Germany. just kept things ticking along because Germany was doing okay, even though, of course, the wheels were beginning to fall off a decade ago with its lack of modernization of industrialization as one example. But generally just went along with the status quo, didn't contradict the US, just implemented all the policies, made all the right noises. That's the basic premise for being a president or a prime minister. And that's above everything else is just the fundamental basis as to why any Western leader who dared to step outside those very strict parameters would very quickly find they were no longer president or prime minister in some way, shape, or form. Okay, there's an argument that might be quite difficult, but I don't think they'd have any trouble finding a way to remove someone from office. I mean, saying things is one thing, but if you start to become a real problem and you appear to be contradicting the establishment, you've got problems. And there are notable exceptions. I think Orban's a good example of this in Hungary, where he is very contradictory a lot of the time. He's very critical of NATO policies, of the European Union, and obviously about the importance of sovereignty of Hungary. But equally, he's very staunchly supportive of Israel. He never votes against Israel on anything, or Hungary doesn't in the UN. So it's not, in totality, but he's very unpopular, and there's no doubt there were moves to try and get him out of office, but he's so popular amongst the people that it's very difficult to do that. But that's generally the basis. So then the question is, after that, is why is that happening, and who's kind of issuing the edicts, and on that basis, then you start to dig into who some of the players are in this so-called deep state.
It's fascinating when you take a look at the U.S. You can almost really set things. Well, I'll give a quick example. In the past, the U.S. had to deal with its bureaucracy coming from the federal government. In the 1800s, there was a lot of cronyism, because the president would come in there, he'd hire his buddies, and they'd run the departments, and they'd be the ambassadors, and they'd do willy-nilly, and the president really didn't care. Then in the 1880s, I think it was Grover Cleveland passed the Civil Service Act, which meant that the positions within the bureaucracy would be made based on merit and testing and things like that, which, you cannot, it is impossible not to have a bureaucracy when running something as big as a government. The hardest part is holding them accountable. And if you don't lay down the law early in that accountability by either indictments, firings, or that type of thing, then that bureaucracy will expand upon itself. And in the end, it becomes a creature unto itself, where it always seeks more power. It always seeks to get bigger. And as we saw, moving forward to like 1947 and the National Security Act, this is the where they had the merging of the Navy Department and the War Department, creating the Department of Defense, the creation of the CIA and other three-letter agencies. The NSA would come shortly after. But all of a sudden, you expand the bureaucracy, and you make accountability further and further and further and further away from the central point of government. One of the examples that I really like in the past and in the present of how to deal with the bureaucracy and keep that establishment, that deep state, from getting too powerful or too big was at the time of Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne did not formulate France in the Dark Ages, but what he did was he broke France into 50 different counties. And for those who don't know, the title of nobility, count, was a provincial governor over one of those counties. Charlemagne traveled the entirety of his life from one county to the other, checking what was going on, knowing what was going on, holding those counts and those provincial governors accountable, firing those whatever, cutting off their heads if they were really egregious, or corrupt, but he always kept an understanding, and that bureaucracy knew that they were accountable to the central point. Now take a look at China. China has many similar facets. They have provincial governors. As a matter of fact, Xi Jinping started out as a provincial governor, and he was good at his job. He wasn't corrupt, and he eventually made his way to the presidency. Well, in China, if you're a provincial governor and you are found for corruption, that's it. They know that they're either going to go to jail for a long time or they're going to be summarily executed. So there is a way, because you have to have that bureaucracy to function in government. But you also must have the rule of law, that no one's above the law, and that the bureaucracy is there at the behest of the central government, not able to do things autonomously. And we see this with the Supreme Court in a recent ruling, repealing the Chevron ruling, which had allowed bureaucracies and government agencies in the U.S. to be able to determine on their own how best to facilitate legislation and laws that were made by Congress. Well, man is naturally susceptible to corruption and ideologies and things like that. Just take a look at what they've done to Donald Trump. Lawfare attacks, attempts to ruin his businesses, trying to get him off the ballot, impeachments. There are a whole myriad of ways when a bureaucracy is not held accountable that they can run roughshod and do their own thing. That is a detriment to not only the people, but the country itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in a broader sense, I mean, we've had historically other examples. I mean, in the US, when JFK was assassinated, clearly, whatever you might term the deep state or those kind of interested parties decided enough was enough. It's clearly, obviously, an inside job. And we're not going to get into the discussion about that. I'm just using it as an obvious example. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details of Nixon, but Nixon basically had to go for reasons other than the reason they actually got rid of him effectively. So there is a precedent in history to see leaders who step outside what is perceived to be their remit, and therefore actions are taken as a result of that. And you just look in history, in recent history, it's the same thing with Saddam Hussein. The West backed Saddam Hussein until he suddenly didn't do things the United States like, which was just revolving around the dollar and wanting to accept the euro for oil sales, and that no, you can't do that, because in the United States it's all about protecting the dollar. The dollar, it has to be at any cost protected. They'll go to war over it, they'll have regime change, they'll assassinate leaders either directly or indirectly. And the same thing, of course, happened to Gaddafi with respect to the gold-backed dinar and wanting to sell oil again in non-dollar terms. They didn't care about what he did for decades, but then they did care about what he did. And then, of course, they orchestrated the rather fake Arab Spring, and the real point of that was to get rid of Gaddafi. So there are historical precedents for decades, probably principally since World War II. I would think that was a fair assessment. And then also, of course, the other point with regards to removing people from power is the issue that sometimes there can be situations where some individual within a government actually tends to overstep the mark, but it's not something they do internally. I mean, generally, the US doesn't care what someone does internally. They can wreck a country internally. They don't care. But if you start to make policy decisions internally that may affect the broader consensus, so that could happen in the European Union, for example, because you start to implement policies that effectively would give you more sovereign control, or you try to, they will do everything through the European Commission to prevent that happening. So it's generally not something domestic. And this is why I think there's this belief that every country has deep states in them, and like the West does. And I don't subscribe to that point of view. There's no doubt there are competing influences, and there's no doubt, like Russia's an example of this, where it's often touted that, all the oligarchs who Putin effectively neutralized in the sense of just crushed them out of existence, and because they had enormous power when the Soviet Union collapsed. But that was more just business interests, etc. It wasn't some sort of hierarchy that exists like it does in the West. So I think it's more an external problem if you start misbehaving within your country. And that ties in with don't do anything questions. The Israelis don't do anything that contradicts NATO, or don't introduce any policies that can be damaging to the United States, principally. Now, I'm not saying the US is to blame for absolutely everything, but fundamentally, most of it, sadly, you can attribute to the US. And because the US is the hegemonic power, and the US is one who's constantly trying to project that power all over the world, though increasingly, of course, that is no longer the case. But particularly since World War II, and probably maybe even up to 10, 15 years ago, that was very much the case. That if the US wanted a war starting somewhere, it would happen. If the US was very successful in having color revolutions. But I think, having said all that, maybe it's good to draw back and use the US as an example of the kind of problems that exists because a US president, again, is just a figurehead. They're not there to make any policy decisions. They sign bits of paper. They turn up at meetings. They look like to the American population like this is our commander-in-chief. There's nothing commanding or in chief about anything. It's exactly the opposite. And I think that's probably a good starting point to assess what kind of forces are at play that basically prevents a US president being a US president.
Yeah, it's interesting because you go to the Constitution, how it was originally set. The executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch were each given particular assignments and authority and power within the government. Now, of course, you have to hire a bureaucracy. You have legislative staff, you have judicial staff, and then, of course, you have executive offices to be able to fulfill these, the desires and the laws and the commands coming from each of those different branches. The problem that comes from that is, over time, some new piece of legislation comes in. We'll say the 1979 Department of Education Act. Well, for 150, 200 years, we never really needed the federal government being involved in education. It was a state or a private institution. But somebody somewhere has this ideological desire, and immediately it creates the need for a department, and that department now has blown up into umpteen proportions that's out of control. That's just one of, I think there was like 843 now different departments under the federal government, and most of them under the executive branch. So how can you control all of these things, especially when originally it's not the central government's purview? Well, Doug Casey, and this is where we sort of got the idea of discussing this, had some thoughts in regards to what can be done in regards to the establishment, the bureaucracy, the deep state. It's kind of weird when you try to figure out which is a more valid statement of what these things are, because obviously one is more clickbait, one is more pragmatic, and then the other is, well, it's hard to understand, the bureaucracy, government by desks. But Trump has already come out and allegedly, this is at least part of his campaign promise, is to bring in individuals who's dedicated solely towards digging in and breaking up that deep state. Whether it's going to be function, whether it's going to work or not, But the fact of the matter is that in his first time in office, in his first term, the deep state really got to him. Once they, two impeachments and a bunch of scandals that held over him, he was unable to function in the capacity that he wanted to, and perhaps the American people wanted to. So he had entered into the office in 2016 with the promise of draining the swamp and breaking the deep state. He didn't do it, and the deep state got him. So what are the outcomes? The deep state either kills or controls the outsider, and Trump is absolutely an outsider. The outsider is able to cripple the deep state. That's something that has happened over time in China, where they have gotten rid of a lot of the corruption that was inherent in the country, or eventually that individual gets co-opted into the deep state and it's just status quo and nothing ever changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the arms of what you might term the deep state in the broader sense of the word is obviously we've mentioned the intelligence agencies, clearly a part of that. And obviously, to some extent, but far less, I feel, the Pentagon you could include as part of that. But that's the kind of, and then the whole military industrial complex, because at the end of the day, they want to sell weapons. So if they want to sell weapons, they have to find reasons to sell weapons. So you either sell them on the basis that a nation or a bogeyman poses a threat, even if they don't. But, hence we need to have NATO. We need to expand NATO because Russia's a threat, as one example. So that's an obvious facet of the deep state, which is extremely important, because a lot of that will also drive US foreign policy. There's no doubt there are elements within the Congress and people associated with it on the periphery, but very much trying to drive policy decisions. And we have seen that clearly on occasions from time to time, where there are certain individuals, and we're not going to get into individuals and talking about specific people, but clearly there are ones who've had agendas and being driven because they have this ideological hatred of Russia, for example, is a very clear, obvious example of that. And that drives policy. And maybe, therefore, you can also arguably say some of these people have some degree of influence, but in the end, that degree of influence can also just be terminated. And it's very obvious that degree of influence with respect to Ukraine now has vanished, because things have played out the way they have, and 2.5 years later, the world's a very different place from that which was probably presented to whoever it was presented to as, well, this is an opportunity to go for Russia and destroy them economically, financially, and obviously destroy the ruble and get rid of Putin in the process. So that's one arm. Another arm that's often hugely overlooked is big corporations, big business. Big business has a massive influence in the United States. And I would certainly say, in inverted commas, that's part of what you might term the deep state. It's not often thought to be, but there are huge, the influential business and bodies that exist in the United States who do have a huge say in policy decisions. The other thing, of course, yes, there's the US Congress. We know all about the influence of the Israeli lobby as one example. But, the whole problem with the US Congress is there should be no donors. There should be none of this money given on the basis of spurious reasons when we know exactly the reason why this is done. That should be completely banned, because that would go a long way to preventing the whole subversion of Congress, because Congress is there just to assist and smooth policy decisions through. And typically, again, what happens domestically, unless it's something that's very damaging to the US's broader interests, less domestically, of course, then it becomes a problem. But generally, it's not a problem. But generally, nothing ever happens. I mean, things get passed in every year in the US Congress, to do with the military or to do with some policy decision. And there's these documents, thousands of pages. No one ever reads them. No one even knows what's written in them, but they pass them. And that just proves just how basically ineffective and ineffectual Congress is. And it's not supposed to be. Again, it's just a conduit to make the American people think you have a democracy. And it's not solely something you can just levy at the United States. It's a problem across all Western nations. So that's just another example where they have an influence as well. But obviously a lot of that is being primed by donors who pay them huge sums of money to push a certain agenda. But that can come from the very powerful business lobby that exists. I mean,
exactly.
Sorry, just one brief point, Ken, to make about Europe. One of the biggest drivers, because Europe's controlled by the United States, is the European Commission. They're all in the back pocket of the United States. They're Atlanticists to drive policy decisions across Europe. That means everybody's lined up, and it's the same with NATO. NATO is the United States. No one else has any say. I mean, Secretary General of NATO is just there as a mouthpiece for Washington. I mean, that's clearly been the case since its inception. And that, again, is another important facet and arm of what you call the deep state. So the deep state can be transcend, of course, international barriers. It transcends countries. But, I mean, and you can apply the same sort of criteria to some degree across Europe. But if you look at German businesses, big corporations, are furious what's happened since the Ukraine war. And they're now getting crippled and the country's being deindustrialized. But they used to have a lot more say and power. They see that power and influence seems to have waned. And in some senses, there's that is a bit surprising. Maybe in some senses, the German business community will at some point say enough's enough, and there'll be a huge backlash. But it's not the same for every country as to who has the most influence or is. But I think to have this idea that there's this deep state hierarchy that is exactly the same that exists in every country, I don't think is a true representation.
Oh, exactly. And because each nation has a different culture. And go back to the time of Peter the Great. He had to deal with the bureaucracy, the aristocracy of the old Muscovites who were so entrenched in there. And it wasn't until he broke that back that Russia could then move forward, bringing in new Western ideas from Europe, et cetera. But they were, he's most known for taking a country that was still living in the dark to Middle Ages and bringing it into the modern age. Fast forward to what you were talking about the corporate power within the establishment / deep state. Putin, in his rise to power, had to deal with oligarchs who controlled the vast majority of industry. And by controlling that industry, they also controlled the political structures. And it wasn't until taking on that, the equivalent of taking on the corporations, that Putin was able to transition Russia into what it is today. Another great example is in Iran, the Islamic Revolution of '79, which broke the back of the deep state that was under Western control under the Shah. El Salvador, that's a recent one, which saw the way to regain the country was to get rid of the gangs that controlled much of society. And then we have the individual in Argentina who just slashed 80% of the entire bureaucracy altogether. So you're absolutely right. There's each culture and each nation has its own, tends to have its own type of bureaucracy that isn't exactly the same as somebody else's, just the basic foundation of a bureaucracy / establishment that over time, especially for political parties that have power for decades, it becomes so entrenched that it is truly the ruling class or the ruling power. And as you noted, the figurehead is just out there. Because what was it you said about Ukraine? You said, or about NATO. Washington controls NATO and the figure in whoever's in charge of it, not the president. Washington, and Washington itself is the deep state / establishment / bureaucracy. It's impossible to say one certain person is doing this. They're doing it as a whole for their own real agendas.
Yeah, just another point to make on this, and this is a great example because we can go back to 2016. I remember this very clearly, when there was clearly, out of nowhere, there was a coup attempt in Turkey to get rid of Erdogan. It failed, and it failed principally because the Russians tipped Erdogan off that it was happening. He obviously survived that coup attempt, and there's never been, I think there was occasionally sort of rumblings about trying to get a coup attempt going again, but never of any substance. And basically, what did Erdogan do to make sure he stayed in power? And you can argue whether, and we're not arguing about the rights and wrongs of this, and whether he should do it. Basically, what he did, he fired a whole bunch of people out the military, out the intelligence agencies, and then put people in positions that he could trust. And it's never been a problem since. Now, the question people would ask is, was that instigated on behalf of the Turkish people? And the answer is no. This was clearly a Western-backed coup, and the West will use the military and intelligence agencies in countries to try and obviously stoke that coup and trying to remove Erdogan. We've seen other examples where they pick on a grievance in a country that the people don't like, and then they get a load of fake protesters out and try and stoke up a kind of color revolution that way. And that's, in the last decade or so, is increasingly failing to materialize. That's not something internal. I mean, Hong Kong's an example, was clearly being fueled by US interests to try and remove the Hong Kong government effectively, because they wanted to get control of Hong Kong again. We saw it where it failed in Kazakhstan as another example. Belarus was another example. So that, again, and that's not an internal thing. That is being fueled principally by the United States, who will use agents provocateurs, but also then to try and get the support internally of the military and also the people and the intelligence agencies to remove someone from office. So that's another example of a deep state operation, but it very rarely do you have something happening internally that is because the people want it. Although, of course, that has happened in recent times in Africa, where we've had military governments taking over, and this is nothing to do with the West. In fact, they were arguably removing presidents, prime ministers of countries who were very Western sympathetic, and then there was just a coup attempt. Then they just overthrew the government and put these military juntas in place. So Burkina Faso's, Mali's another example, and Niger, and that was an internal decision. That's not so much a deep state thing. That was more just to do with the fact that the country had had enough, or the military decided enough was enough, and they were going to change the government. So sometimes there are things happening. It's got nothing to do with the deep state. Sometimes it is, but a lot of internal changes that happen across the world is nothing to do with the desires of the people inside a country. It's often something the United States is involved. You can argue the UK is involved as well. Sometimes there are European countries also involved in that process. So it's an immensely complicated subject. You could talk for many, many hours about it, but I think what we've tried to do is give people some kind of different perspective as to what it actually means, rather than this just blanket assumption that the word means something. Well, it means a lot more than conventional wisdom would suggest. Again, it's not one of those black and white situations.
Exactly. And it's as old as time, or man, or government, or any of those. Anyway,
Absolutely.
Paul, want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report, thank you for being a part of this great community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, comment, helps the algorithms. Pass this on to anybody you think it might be of importance. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.